Hi everyone, this is lecture number 4 for Latin America, Independence Movements, and it corresponds to pages 469 to 485 of your textbook. All right, well, nationalism means pride or love for one's country. There are many things that can contribute to this feeling. When people share the same language, ethnic background, or life experiences, all of these types of things can make people want to have their own nation or country. Beginning in 1810, and a little before that actually, many Latin American colonies had developed their own identities, all of which were different from the cultures of Spain and Portugal. Additionally, many people were upset by Spanish and Portuguese colonial rule. Many Creoles, that's to say the American-born peoples, they felt that they were completely disenfranchised as Spanish citizens. Under the peninsular system, they were never equal to the highest class of people, or the peninsulars. This anger, along with new Enlightenment ideas from Europe, will result in Latin American colonies demanding their independence from Spain and Portugal. These revolutions were inspired by a number of things. I believe that all revolutions in history display a pattern. All revolutions share certain root causes or characteristics. I use the acronym GENOS to describe these characteristics. G, meaning government or political problems. E, meaning economic problems, N, meaning new ideas or philosophies, O, other revolutions, and finally S, social inequality. I'm going to discuss Latin American revolutions using this acronym. All right, well, first, G, government problems. Many Creoles felt that they didn't have the right to rule. And this was all based on the fact that they were born into the second highest social class. They could never move up the social ladder. Under the peninsular system, only Spanish-born citizens held power. This angered the Creoles, so there were government problems. People felt like they weren't being represented. E, economic problems. Under the peninsular system, the peninsulars held most of the colonial wealth, including the large haciendas or plantations. Under the economic system of mercantilism, colonies were not allowed to engage in trade without Spain's permission. All trade was supposed to benefit Spain. Many colonists felt like the time had come for their piece of the pie, and they wanted a say in their own economic system. N, new ideas or philosophies. During the 1700s, new ideas in Europe resulted in a period of time called the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. Philosophers like John Locke questioned kings and queens' right to rule. Locke argued that if you didn't like your own government because it wasn't respecting what he called natural rights, then he believed that people had the right to have a revolution and overthrow their ruler and replace them with a ruler who would respect natural rights. Ideas like Locke's, or those of Locke, inspired revolutionary activity across Europe and helped contribute to a sense of unity and nationalism in the colonies. O, other revolutions. The American colonies will demand independence in 1776 from England, resulting in the American Revolution. Later, in France, the French will demand an end to their absolute monarchy and had their own revolution, beginning in 1789. This revolution spanned almost 10 years and only ended when a ruler named Napoleon took power in 1799. Napoleon used a powerful French army to conquer much of Europe until his eventual defeat in 1815. You will learn more about him next year as 10th graders. However, Napoleon's conquests around the globe helped spread revolutionary ideas to colonies in Latin America. These revolutionary ideas inspired people to do what the Americans and French had done. Finally, S, social inequality. The Spanish colonists were fed up with the peninsular system under which they were second-class citizens. Right. So now let's discuss these Latin American independence movements. There were many people who helped the colonies in Latin America gain their independence. In French-ruled Haiti, a former slave named Toussaint Louverture organized a group of rebel soldiers in 1791 and reclaimed the island for the Haitians. When Napoleon took power in 1799 back in France, he vowed to reclaim Haiti as a French territory or colony. In 1802, Napoleon attacked Haiti, and he captured Louverture, who was then sent to a prison in France, where he died in 1803. Many of Napoleon's soldiers ended up dying in Haiti due to diseases like yellow fever. Many of Napoleon's troops abandoned the island and deserted their posts out of fear of illness. This allowed Haiti to declare its independence from France in 1804. The Haitian Revolution inspired Latin American nations to secure their independence as well. Now, because Napoleon weakened much of Europe due to conquest, especially Spain, where he actually put his own brother Joseph in power as a king, the Spanish lost control over their colonies. Strong leaders in Latin America emerged, determined to win their independence. One of these nationalists was Simón Bolívar, a Creole. Bolívar became known as the Liberator and helped to establish the nations of Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Peru. Bolívar worked closely with another Creole nationalist leader to free Ecuador and Peru. His name was José de San Martín. In addition to helping to gain independence for Ecuador and Peru, San Martín helped to liberate Chile by pairing up with another nationalist Creole named Bernardo O'Higgins. By 1825, most of Latin American Spanish colonies had gained their independence. Mexico also became an independent nation. One of the leaders of Mexican independence from Spain included a priest named Miguel Hidalgo, who wrote a nationalistic speech called Grito de Dolores, in which he urged people to fight Spanish colonial rule. This Grito de Dolores became the rallying cry of nationalists across Latin America. Hidalgo demanded more rights for the poor in Mexico, where there was much inequality. Hidalgo was captured by Spanish soldiers and executed for treason before a firing squad. However, another nationalist priest, José Morelos, who was a mestizo, led the Mexican independence movement. Morelos was also captured and executed in 1815. Mexico won its initial independence from Spain with the help of Agustín de Iturbide in 1821. And I do not speak Spanish, so I'm butchering these, I'm sorry. Iturbide ruled as a dictator for 2 years. He was forced to step down in 1823, and Mexico became a democratic republic with a new constitution. For a while, Central American nations were part of Mexico. However, they will declare themselves independent as well and joined together to form the United Provinces of Central America. After 15 years together, the 5 nations broke apart into 5 separate nations: El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. Brazil also became independent from Portugal, but followed a different route. Napoleon had taken over Portugal. The Portuguese king and his family fled to Brazil. When the Portuguese king returned to Portugal following Napoleon's defeat in 1815, he left his son behind to rule Brazil as king. King Pedro agreed to rule under a limited monarchy in Brazil, and he agreed to the writing of a constitution. Brazil remained a monarchy until 1889 and then became a democratic republic. What's a republic, you ask? It's a form of government in which the people have the power. Well, if you recite the Pledge of Allegiance, then you know this term, right? Yes, we're a republic here in the U.S. Good connection. Woot woot. All right, so you'd think that with the independence came freedom and goodness for all people in Latin America. And although it was nice for these places to gain independence from Spain and Portugal, many of these new republics were going to face some major challenges. First of all, geographic barriers prevented unity amongst the new nations. Additionally, some of these new nations had border disputes with one another, leading to war. Geographic barriers also prevented unity by contributing to a sense of regionalism, which we've already learned is where you have strong local traditions that divide people within a country or region. Other problems in Latin America included deep divisions within nations. Social class systems like the peninsular system still dominated life in most places, and the gap between the rich and poor widened. Finally, with little democratic tradition in these nations, many new leaders struggled to rule due to lack of experience. This lack of experience made many new nations vulnerable to revolutions and military takeovers. In some nations, leaders argued with one another, leading to power struggles. In such an unstable environment, military leaders called caudillos often stepped up and ruled as dictators. In Mexico, General Antonio López de Santa Anna took over Mexico as a caudillo 6 different times from 1832 to 1855. In Argentina, Juan Manuel de Rosas led the nation as a caudillo. He stayed in power for 17 years until being overthrown by another caudillo. Mexico also endured a civil war for many years in the late 1800s until being ruled by Benito Juarez. Juarez was the first Native American president in Mexico. Unfortunately, Juarez was followed by a dictator named Diaz, who brutally ruled for over 30 years. The people of Latin American nations have often supported these caudillos and their overthrowing of governments because they are promised reforms by these types of leaders. By the late 1800s, Latin America was slightly more stable, but many nations were governed by powerful elite families called oligarchies. The Catholic Church continues to play an important role in people's lives in Central America, often supporting people against this type of oligarchic structure. Often they have fought for reforms on behalf of the people when governments are violating rights. The Catholic Church in Latin America has championed educational reform, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, as well as other civil liberties. The Catholic Church has also tried to implement programs to address poverty. Most nations of Latin America today are considered to be developing nations. Many countries are still dependent on cash crops. This dependence makes countries highly unstable economically speaking should their cash crop fail due to drought, pests, or flooding. Latin American nations are also still dependent on foreign nations in terms of trade and often have unfavorable balances of trade. This means that they import more goods than they export. The dependence on other nations for products and help is often called economic imperialism. Many nations in Latin America have large debts that are almost impossible for them to pay off, creating a situation where they can never get ahead. During the 1900s, this economic instability was often accompanied by political and social divisions within individual nations. Following World War II, with the start of the Cold War period, these divisions became even more pronounced. Many countries experienced coups. A coup d'état means a revolt, usually by military leaders, against a nation's government. The military will then take over the government or take control of the government. They are able to do this because they have the means or the weapons to accomplish this. This was how Napoleon took over France in 1799, remember? It's actually a French term that translates roughly to a punch to the state. In many places, coups took place and dictators stepped into power by promising people things like land and reform. In many parts of Latin America, only the richest people own property, and poor people can never afford their own bit of land. In El Salvador, the 14 families owned all of the best land. These oligarchies controlled land and politics. Because of these types of situations, Marxist socialism, or communism, was appealing to many of the landless people in Latin America. Under a purely communist state, there is no private land ownership. Instead, the government owns it and redistributes it to people. Examples of where this type of takeover and subsequent land reform took place include Chile, beginning in 1969, when a leader named Salvador Allende took over. Unfortunately, some of the socialist leaders who took over didn't redistribute the land as they had promised, and instead, they created totalitarian states. Such was the case in Cuba in 1959, when a reformer named Fidel Castro launched a revolution against a corrupt dictator. Castro gained power and established a communist totalitarian state that became a proxy state during the Cold War between the U.S. and USSR. Although Castro did seize private property and established a command economy, Cubans still struggle to survive. Command economies usually result in a lower standard of living, including a lack of consumer products. It's only a matter of time before Cubans demand a change of leadership and demand a higher standard of living. Fidel Castro stayed in power until 2010, but due to illness, his brother, Raul Castro, took over and leads today as of 2014. Cuba's relationship with the U.S. has been tense due to their alliance with the Soviets during the Cold War. You will learn all about two tense situations when you study the Cold War as 10th graders, including an incident called the Bay of Pigs, as well as an event called the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'll talk about both of these in my next lecture. We narrowly escaped a nuclear holocaust in October 1962 when the Soviets placed nuclear weapons in Cuba and pointed them at the U.S., leading to a standoff in which we almost fired at each other, which would have led to World War III, or mutually assured destruction. Today, Cuba's economy is in shambles. One contributing factor is the lack of trade with nations like the U.S. The U.S. has had an embargo or complete halt of trade with Cuba since the 1960s. Other Latin American nations that have suffered similar fates include Nicaragua, where dictator after dictator ruled for many years. In 1979, a U.S.-supported dictator named Anastasio Somoza was overthrown by a group of socialist rebels called the Sandinistas, who were led by a guy named Daniel Ortega, and were supported financially by the Soviet Union. The U.S. wanted to see the Sandinistas lose power, and so supported a paramilitary group of rebels called the Contras. A long guerrilla war ensued for many years. Free elections were finally held in 1990 when Violeta Chamorro became president. And we'll talk more on this in our next lecture. Thanks for listening. Bye.